Welcome to the Patreon that I forgot to write January 2025 Q&A, where not only will I be answering your questions, but I'm also going to paint something for the first time in probably over a decade. And while I won't be asking you to follow along with me, I will invite you to try and guess what I'm trying to depict as I'm painting this. But I'm just gonna say that I'm just gonna say that it's not going to be very easy. Not only because what I'm going to paint is very niche, but also because I'm probably not even like N5 at painting, so yeah, I have no clue how this is going to go. But I'm going to start out with some titanium white, and I'm also going to get into the first question. So the first question comes from Nemubaku asking, how do you resist bargaining with yourself to get out of doing something? For example, I'll just do half my workout today since I did extra yesterday, or I'll cut down my new Anki cards but I'll do double in the summer. And I'd say that sometimes it's actually fine to cut things shorter if it's justified and you know that you're going to actually keep your promise. For example, when I have some time urgent things that I need to deal with, I sometimes do cut my gym days shorter because I know that I can just finish those remaining exercises on the next day, which otherwise would have been a rest day anyway. Also, back in the first few months of getting started with Anki, I cut my new cards down from 10 to 6 to eventually 5 because it just started taking way too long for me, and reducing the workload made sure that I was able to stay consistent, and I knew that eventually I can once again increase my daily new cards, which I did. However, when it comes to the occasions where you're pushing things away not for some justified reason, but just because you don't feel like dealing with them right now, then keep in mind that the more you push those things away to make the present easier, the harder the future will become. If you skip Anki today, you'll have twice as many cards to do tomorrow. If you skip gym today, you potentially need to do even more work down the road to reach the same results. And when it comes to a bunch of other things, such as studying or whatever, once the day comes when you're finally supposed to catch up, who's to say that when that day comes that you'll be more motivated then than you are now? Maybe life will be even more in the way, so not only are you less motivated to continue, but there's a high chance that you're going to be overwhelmed as well. So essentially, if it's calculated and you know that you can trust yourself, then rescheduling some things to the next day is fine. However, in the case it's not, then just try to avoid the instant gratification of pushing those things away as much as possible, because you're essentially training the neural pathways that push things away, so already the next time you're doing them, you have already trained yourself to push things away instead of actually doing them. Alright, time for the next question, which also comes from Nemubaku, and I'll just say that even though I'm going to answer every question that I received in this video, starting from the next one, I'll limit to one question per person per month, because otherwise I might get like 100 questions total from just 5 people. But the second question is, what does my process for creating a video look like? And I almost always start a video by writing most, if not the entire script up front, after which I go searching for some background music or vice versa, and once I have the music, I start narrating. And believe it or not, 1 to 2 minutes of narration, generally speaking, takes me around an hour, because I do hundreds of retakes until the delivery gets as close to perfection as possible. And you might have noticed that in this video, in this Q&A, the narration sounds a bit lower quality than usual, and the reason why is because I'm trying to be a bit more loose with the narration, because otherwise, if it's going to be a 30-minute video, the narration alone might take me 20 to 40 hours. But the thing is that I can only narrate for a maximum of 2 to 3 hours per day before my voice gets too tired, meaning that the slow pace of my narration has been holding me back for the longest time, which is why I really want to practice alternative voiceover styles, and this Q&A seems like a perfect opportunity for that. But anyway, once I have at least a few minutes of narration finished, I start editing and coming up with background footage, which also takes me forever, because sometimes I spend 2 hours on a 5-second clip just for it to end up being some kind of a screenshot or something. And this approach definitely gets the job done for a format like mine, but its shortcoming is that scripting and narrating everything up front makes it very difficult to go on unrelated tangents or make changes once everything has already been laid out. However, the first video on this channel is slightly different from the others in the sense that while I was working on it, I moved one small chunk at a time, which made the video a bit more dynamic, and I also had a bit more room for funny jokes and such as well. And of course, recently I started making more vloggy type videos as well, where I'm attempting live commentary as opposed to scripted narration, but that also means that I first have to gather most of the clips before I can even start editing. But since that gives me a level of freedom that I've never had before, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to go about creating them. And even though I'm absolutely terrible without doing 1,000 retakes when it comes to both live commentary as well as scripted narration and unscripted narration, I realized that I need to experiment with different formats as well, because eventually YouTube is just not going to be sustainable for me if it takes me around a month of non-stop grinding to make a single video. So that is another reason why I started experimenting with the vloggy style videos as well, but also because I just want to discover what other types of videos I could make that I would potentially enjoy making. The reason I started making YouTube videos already when I was like 8 years old was because it was something that I naturally enjoyed. I just enjoyed making videos and posting them somewhere. And even though now I'm capable of grinding out videos out of sheer discipline, what I want is to actually enjoy not only releasing videos, but also the process of creating them as well. So right now, in 2025, even though I'm still gonna keep it balanced, I'm also on a quest to optimize my videos in terms of how much I personally enjoy making them. Okay, the next question comes from Rinkas asking, what do you think about the Japanese courses on Migaku, as well as where did you mine Yu Yu Hakusho with Migaku? And I've checked out the Japanese courses on Migaku a bit, and they seem very detailed as well as good quality, and I personally really like that they're flashcard based, and in theory they also get you ready for sentence mining. But something I noticed was that the example sentences are a bit odd in the sense that they are really casual and the voice acting is like straight out of anime. But maybe that makes the learning process a bit less dry and more interesting, and as long as you immerse, you'll pick up the more polite forms of the language anyway, so. And I mined Yu Yu Hakusho with Migaku from Animelon, which is a site that has tons of anime with Japanese subtitles available, and Migaku also works with it, so in terms of sentence mining, it's literally a gold mine. The next question comes from Sal, essentially asking whether or not I make separate cards for word plus grammar combinations such as junbisuru. And since the main question is about Korean, it's a bit hard to answer since I don't really know the significance of learning those things separately when it comes to Korean, but I'll just say up front that the question of what to mine is something that at the end of the day you have to figure out by yourself. But usually when it comes to words, I just mine the default form of it and only mine the different forms if they have a distinct or special definition. So question 6 comes from a fox, apparently, asking, how do you manage your interests? Do you take breaks or do you just jump to the next task? I want to do so much, but realistically, I only have a couple of hours each day. And I've also come to the realization that unfortunately, I just have too many interests and I've had to either give up on some of them or postpone them until I'm done with, for example, sentence mining and Anki. One of those things is drawing, which I'll talk a bit more about later in the video, but my general advice is that you just have to find time from somewhere, even if it means taking time from some other interests in exchange for a different one. You can maybe even make a schedule like on certain days you only do certain activities, but ideally it would be best to find time from unimportant activities such as mindless scrolling that you can replace with Anki, for example, or when resting between sets in the gym and so on. But let's say that you're going to spend your time on gaming, for example. Well, you can try to optimize entertainment. For example, you can try doing gaming only in Japanese, or if you're going to play something like League, you can only allow yourself to play with natives in voice chat, but that kind of requires you to already be in Japan as well as pretty much fluent in Japanese already. So you can also think of it this way: quit League for now until you're fluent in Japanese 10 years from now. But related to this question, I also recommend checking out the Q&A that I made in 2021, where I mentioned that if you have a job and if it's possible, instead of working full-time, you can perhaps ask if you can work half-time, and you can then use that extra time that you just received productively, which is something that I did as well. The next question comes from Ferry, who says, over 3 years ago, I stumbled on your channel through your Japanese Duolingo video, and it inspired me to learn Japanese myself, which I've actually stuck with ever since. I am now planning on going to Japan for a year or so, similar to you, so can you maybe share some insights about getting a visa, finding accommodation, living expenses, and so on? So first of all, thanks for all the support over the years, and when it comes to visiting Japan, if you actually need a visa, then I only have experience with the working holiday visa, which really wasn't that difficult to attain, at least for myself here in Estonia. But already for the visa application, you need to know where you're going to be staying in Japan, and I don't have much advice to give for the simple reason that I had an opportunity to stay in Japan at someone's house instead of having to search for an apartment myself. There are companies in Japan that rent apartments to even foreigners with no questions asked, even for shorter periods, that also include furniture and have bills covered in the rent as well, but they're just extremely expensive. And then Ferry has another question, which is that, have you ever struggled with staying consistent pursuing your goals, for example Anki, lifting, and so on, and if so, how did you overcome it? So like I said earlier in the video, I did struggle with Anki when it started taking a lot of time when I was just getting started with it, which is why I decreased my number of new cards. But to be honest, even now, I do have days where Anki really feels like a drag, but on those days I just do what I've always done, which is just to push through it and move forward. And at this point, it's already such a habit that I don't even really think about it anymore. And lifting has become really similar at this point, especially now that I have a home gym. But generally speaking, over the past 8 years, the longest breaks I've had are usually always a maximum of only a month or so due to some illness or something. But I've had periods of burnout like I described in one of my videos, but there really isn't much to do about it other than to adjust something to keep yourself going, whether it be your program, number of days per week, or your mindset, or just to push through it until you just start feeling more motivated, which has happened to me dozens of times. I also recommend watching my 10 motivational tips video as it relates to pretty much any endeavor. Okay, next question from Gear Mike. First of all, thank you for making such great videos. They have always been an inspiration and I always love their vibe. Have you ever struggled with having too high expectations for yourself and burning out? And I actually mentioned burning out in one of my earlier videos, so I recommend watching that, but rather than it being from having too high expectations for myself, it's more accurate to say that I had a level of duality between two different mindsets that clashed and caused a lot of cognitive dissonance, and this is something I've subtly referred to in many of my videos, but I've never told the full story of it. But long story short, by now I've pretty much figured it out, which is also why I haven't experienced an actual burnout from what I'm doing right now, despite having gone through many very stressful periods. But I've always managed to do something to prevent an actual burnout before it happens, which is yet another reason why I'm currently experimenting with different video formats. And the next question is, how useful do you think modern media, for example YouTube and video games, really are? As for me, I certainly enjoy playing games, but if I had never access to them in my life, I will probably be just as happy and have more time for other hobbies that have more quote-unquote real-life results. That's kind of a paradox for me. I don't know if people can relate. And this is another topic that relates to the previous question, meaning that it's once again something that I've subtly talked about in many of my videos. In fact, the video I made last year about League of Legends is very much related to this, and even though the video is 42 minutes long, the real message behind the video starts at the 33-minute mark. So I recommend watching that video, but I'd also like to add that it might take a bit of time, but if you reflect and think for yourself, you'll figure out the answer to this question by yourself, but only if you approach it from multiple different perspectives instead of thinking about it in a binary manner. And the reason why is because if you come to a black or white answer, the other side will most likely have some kind of a counter argument that you closed your eye to. So instead of reaching a conclusion that leads to harmony, you'll be left with internal inner conflict. The next question comes from Nora Scheidley, who asks, have you purposely avoided creating cards for words that are too obscure? So when I was getting started with sentence mining, I skipped a lot of words that back then I thought were too obscure, but looking back at, I will definitely mine. But that's also because my goal is to become as fluent as possible, at least up to a certain point. So generally speaking, for myself, if a word is in my immersion and I need to look it up, then I technically needed to know that word, and I've been surprised at how many times I've seen those quote-unquote obscure words again later down the road. But there definitely are things that I don't usually mind, such as names of people or locations and so on, or obscure Buddhist origin words and kanji that you might see in move names in anime and so on. Though, like I said before, you have to figure out what to and what not to mine by yourself over time. But I'd like to say that if you're starting out and can find tons of new words very quickly, you can have higher thresholds for whether or not you mine something. And the reason why is because I don't recommend stocking up hundreds or thousands of new cards from your immersion, because it's much easier to do reviews of new cards when you just recently mined them. For example, when I was mining 20 new cards a day, I usually moved one day at a time, so I often did reviews for the cards that I mined on the same day. And I also sometimes just did extra immersion without doing sentence mining once I already had hit 20 cards for the day. But it's still fine to have like a few weeks worth of cards piled up, because then on the days where you don't have time for sentence mining, you can still stay consistent with your reviews. The next question comes from Kyle Conway, who asks, by now, are you consuming more content in Japanese daily compared to English? And I definitely don't, especially now that I left Japan, as my work is almost exclusively in English and real life mostly in Estonian, meaning that I don't get much Japanese input outside of sentence mining, Anki, and a bit of chatting. And next is a question by Andrew. A bit random, but I'd love to hear your thoughts given your deep dive on training neural networks a few years ago. What are your thoughts on recent developments in large language models, especially the quote-unquote alignment faking in Cloud Tree Opus? And yeah, I used to really immerse in AI and especially in deep learning for multiple years when I was learning it and eventually using it at work. I even used to read research papers with my very limited math knowledge, and I even had a long list of kind of philosophical thoughts related to AI and deep learning and such. But I actually haven't really touched AI programming for around 5 years now, because I just don't have a use case for it. And that's why I'm also a bit out of the loop when it comes to particular phenomenons in the modern AI models, but I can say that the current actual problems born from AI, and especially from large language models, were something that were already theorized already before LLMs even existed, but now that they're already an actual reality, there is no real solution except for society to be aware of the potential risks of over-reliance, over-trusting, and over-applying black box models. Okay, the next question comes from Alex Dupre, who asks, started using Migaku and noticed that sometimes the parser will treat the kanji version of a word and the kana version as separate words. For example, gohan and gohan. I've seen both used out in the wild. In this case, do you mark both words as known, or do you mark one as known and mark the others as ignore? Indeed, it treats them as two separate words, and I just mark both of them as known, but that just depends on how you personally like to use the tracking system. However, I'd like to add that when it comes to mining them, I don't think they're worth mining separately, especially because if you know the kanji version, you'll know the hiragana version regardless. However, on certain rare occasions, the kanji, hiragana, and sometimes even the katakana versions can all have different meanings and nuances, which is something worth keeping in mind. Next question comes from a Kevbot, who asks, do you take new cards at the beginning, end, or mixed with your reviews? And I used to take them mixed when I was doing the Core 2K6K deck, but now for the longest time I've been taking them at the end of my reviews, which I find so much easier. But they also have another question, which is, how much direct grammar study did you do compared to immersion in terms of time spent? And I don't really know how many hours I studied grammar for, as I just read through everything on Takim's website. I read the tips on apps like Duolingo and Lingodeer in the beginning. I did a few grammar Anki decks in the past, occasionally googled questions that I had, but I feel like I got the most gains just by sentence mining grammar points and picking things up naturally through immersion. Sometimes I still hesitate a bit before conjugating certain words during outputting, as I'm basically just winging it through intuition instead of having memorized the rules. So if I really wanted to improve at that more directly, I could just start drilling conjugation rules again, but for the time being, I've been noticing improvements just by getting more input once again, so I haven't really felt the need for that. But Kevbot has one more question, which is that, are you still drawing? I've been doing Anki lifting drawing for 3 years now, and I'm curious about how similar or different they are when it comes to improving at them. So I've been actually drawing on and off ever since I made the Drava Box video, and in total, I think I've spent more time on drawing after I made the video than I had before I made the video. but I feel like I'm still 1,000 hours away from not being a complete beginner. I actually even drew quite a bit at one point when I was in Japan, but recently I haven't drawn for multiple months again as I haven't had the time for it, and I also haven't had time to make a video about drawing, especially because it takes a lot of time just to gather footage if it's going to be something similar to the previous one I made. However, with these new experimental videos, I might be able to feature drawing again, like I am in this video, which is once again pretty exciting, and it's yet another reason why I've been wanting to try a different format. And when it comes to how similar are learning Japanese, drawing and lifting, I'd say that they are all similar in the sense that they all require consistency over multiple years to see significant progress, but I'd say that lifting is the most unique in the sense that sometimes just consistency and putting in the hours isn't going to be enough. For example, I'm more knowledgeable and more consistent when it comes to lifting now more than ever. Even in Japan, I was pretty hardcore when it came to lifting. Yet, despite all that, on the surface, I've barely made any progress. In fact, I'm actually weaker now, for example on the big tree, compared to 2023. The reason why is because I'm a bit lighter than I used to be, and I've also reached a point where even if I have the quote-unquote perfect program with the perfect consistency, I cannot make significant progress unless I'm in a caloric surplus. So, as opposed to linearly accumulative skills such as Japanese or drawing, lifting is something where you can actually lose months if not years of progress in a very short period of time, which has happened to me many times. Alright, now there are 3 questions by G. Newton, starting with, do you have any tips for working out on a 4-week trip to Japan? And my answer is that because you probably won't have gym access, you really don't have much else of a choice other than to do some kind of a bodyweight routine. But while there definitely are calisthenic parks in Japan, they will most likely be too far away from you most of the time, so you'll probably need to work out in hotels. But if you have big, heavy luggages, you can try using your luggage as a dumbbell or as a rock that you can hold whilst doing squats or something. Next, do you have any tips for vlogging in Japan? I recommend checking out Muran's daily vlogs in Japan for inspiration, but if you're not going to post the vlogs anywhere but just make them for yourself, you can just pull out the camera and record some random stuff whilst talking over it, and perhaps you can say a few random things that happened on that day, which might be fun to rewatch and listen to 5 to 10 years from now. And finally, do you currently bulk or are planning on bulking? Do you have strategies for keeping consistent with calories? Like I said before, since I basically cannot progress without bulking anymore, I've been thinking of going on something like a year-long, very small but consistent caloric surplus, which I haven't officially started yet, as for me, tracking calories and bulking is a full-time job in of itself considering how many other daily duties I already have. But my tip for staying consistent is to actually track your calories every day and to have backup foods in case you're missing, let's say, 600 calories and need to go to sleep in 20 minutes. Okay, and it's finally time for the final question, which comes from Mike's, who has a nice profile picture, but is also a big supporter, so I have to say big thanks. And the question is, would you consider yourself to be a furry? And this is actually not the first time I've been asked this question, but yeah, I'm really not sure where it's coming from. But anyway, here is the final result. Painting this was so much more difficult than I expected, so the result isn't really one-to-one with what I imagined, but I wonder how many people know what this is. I can't guess this yet, but those who know definitely know though. I gotta say though that I actually really enjoyed painting this and I already wanna do it again, so I'm also already looking forward to the next Q&A, which is going to be in February, or rather at the end of February. So if you want your question to be answered on video, then you can go ahead and ask on Patreon, and if you want some FOMO, then I might not actually make a Q&A every month, and even if I do, I might not make it into a video every time, so... But anyway, my camera actually has 2% battery left, so I need to end this video